and welcome to a brand new episode of Talking Law from Women in the Law UK. I'm Sally Penni, a barrister based in Manchester at Kenworthy's Chambers and the Joint Vice Chair of the Association of Women Barristers. I'm also the founder of Women in the Law UK, an organisation which is passionate about supporting the next leaders in law. Find out more at womeninthelawuk.com. You could also connect with us on social media. We'd love to hear from you. Find us on Twitter at Women in the Law UK. Find us on LinkedIn. Just search for Women in the Law UK. On this episode, I'm delighted to bring you an interview with one of the most inspiring women at the bar, Anesta Weekes QC. Called in 1981, Anesta is recognised for her work internationally, both prosecuting and defending serious criminal offences. She regularly appears in the Court of Appeal, as well as being appointed a recorder in 1999, and has many, many years of sitting in the Crown Courts as a judge in serious criminal trials. She discussed her passion for advocacy and how her love of music helps her well-being. Anesta told me how her career began working with some very famous names.
I began my career in really one of the most exciting sets at the time, Cloisters. There were some very big names there. Mike Mansfield was my then pupil master. Stephen Segley's a name that will ring a bell. He was on the High Court bench. Laura Cox will ring a bell. Brian Langstaff. John Platts Mills will ring a bell. So I owe it to those chambers for having given me the guidance I was able to imbibe from people who were excellent. I was the first Black female tenant in those chambers. A wonderful man from South Africa, Dabi Kamalo, he was in the set at the time. I had a wonderful practice and honed my skills on several magistrate court cases, then into the Crown Court. I practiced in employment law. So that was a civil area that I really enjoyed. I sat as a part-time chairman in employment law for a while. So I was a part-time employment law judge. I then also became a part-time criminal judge, a recorder. It's been a wonderful life, and I've had the most wonderful cases, exciting work.
Interesting. Well, I wonder if we can just go back a step, if you like. And I wanted to ask you why you chose the law in the first place.
A really good question. I went to a girls' school where I eventually became deputy head girl and then joint head girl. I enjoyed music. I did English and law at university, but at school I did athletics and dance. Because I used to play the violin. I did piano from grade 1 to grade 4. But I really had too much to do all in one go with O-levels and A-levels. So I didn't follow through my first and greatest love, which was music. I still adore music, of course. I listen to all sorts of music. When I exercise, as we're all meant to do, I exercise to house music. Because it's just brilliant. If there's anything that's going to keep you monotonously moving, but actually enjoying a voice, and house music has got the most amazing Black singers, and the rhythms are just quite amazing. So nothing like house music to wake you up in the morning. So you get through 30 minutes of exercise with no difficulty. So what inspired me in this girls' school where I did athletics, where I became one of the sort of top prefects, as it were. I needed a job that was going to pay me well enough so that I would never have to ask my parents for money. I come from a working class background. My father was not always the best of help to my mother. My mother effectively supported the family. And I used to do a paper round. And when I was at university, I would have a summer holiday job. My first ever job was cleaning telephones for a firm called Phonatas. You never forget your first job. And I went to incredibly smart offices in the city. And the first time I tried to clean a telephone, I kept interrupting some bigwig's phone without knowing that I should put down this special thing that would stop the phone going click on and off. Anyway, I did become a really good cleaner of phones. That was my first job. I wanted to become a lawyer, as I said, because I wanted to earn money. I wanted it to be a decent job. I knew my parents weren't very keen on music and dance because I like dance. It had to be something that was professional and that was going to be decent. It was going to provide an income. And this profession certainly does.
Yes, well, it does. And that's quite an interesting reason to come, especially if you didn't know other people in the sector. I wonder, you talked before about being the first black female in the very beginning of your career in those chambers. I remember clearly the first time I saw a black barrister. And this was over 20 years ago. I'm sorry to sort of name check the date, but it was so powerful, not just for me, but for all my colleagues who had to do the compulsory Human Rights Act course.
Oh, yes.
Yes, we were all pupils, and you had the gravy slot of lecturing all these keen barristers or wannabe barristers. In fact, maybe in a bar school, I can't quite remember now. I was the only. I think there was about 2 black students on the course. Loads of us, about over 200 of us. And the gravy slot, you walked on stage, we're all chatting, and the gravy slot's always so dreadful because all the blood from the brain's gone to the stomach. And you walked onto the stage, elegant, clear, and I don't even think you needed to tell us to shut up, but everybody was just quiet. And you delivered what was an intellectually stimulating lecture on the Human Rights Act as it was then. And we were all captivated, all my male colleagues, all my female colleagues. And I was stunned that I'd never seen a black barrister before. I can't quite remember when you took silk, but I thought you were in silk. You must have been in silk because you've been in silk forever. As far as I'm concerned. So I wonder then for you, when you came to the bar, were there many black women or indeed black practitioners? I know you named that one colleague. And how did that feel for you then by comparison to now?
I think it was quite difficult to establish yourself and to make sure that you were treated seriously. I worked really hard. I think all barristers who are good at what they do put the hours in and they learn what is a good method of preparation. And after the preparation, it's the delivery in the courtroom. If there are not very many people who look like me, I'm always going to be remembered. So you want to be remembered for the right thing, which is that was a good performance, that you get on with clients, that you get on with generally judges for whom they are there to give rulings. And often, in difficult cases, you need a ruling from a judge. So the better you present it in a manner in which the judge is more likely to give it to you, if he or she can. You ask for things that you sometimes know you can't get, but when you defend in particular, you have to try. You have to try in the most professional way to do things for your client. So I was aware that there were not very many people who looked like me, but there was a degree of strain and expectation that I had to perform well. That doesn't mean that white lawyers don't have the same strain and the same expectations, but visibly people will remember me more if I fail or if I mess up. I think now it's so wonderfully different. There are so many black women at the bar. I walk into robing rooms and see young black women and I always say hello. And that's partly because I'm a little bit not brilliant at remembering names unless I've met somebody more than once or twice. But they are always quite amazed that I stop and say hello. And I was told that by an individual and I vowed thereafter to always say hello, because it just occurred to me they may not feel as comfortable and brave to come up and say hello to me because of the seniority. I don't agree with that, but let's understand the reality. And this attitude, do say hello to young Black people and whites as well. But there's an obvious reason why I say young Black males and females.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you for that. I skirted it over and I didn't mean to, but I wonder if you can just share a little bit about your practice. You're doing what we call in the trade heavyweight, complex cases. As a well respected silk, any solicitor who's ever instructed you or otherwise and knows of you, judges, barristers, you've got an excellent reputation. But one of the things you've got a passion for is DNA. And I wonder if you can just talk a little bit about that, amongst all your complex, drugs, gangs. I talked to Chris Dorr QC, he's
Yeah.
representing celebrities and what have you. You're representing heavyweight stuff, death row, international work, but your passion for DNA, I just wondered if you could just share a little bit about that.
Yes, absolutely, without disclosing or breaching data protection rules. When you say I have a passion for DNA, I mean, you're right. That was something I mentioned. I, at the moment, have a particular passion for DNA. I don't always have it. But it happens to be that there is a DNA point in one of my cases. And the reason for that is that it's a central part of my defense. And DNA, as you know, is certainly when it was discovered not so long ago, it has become really the forensic science, which is the leader of all the forensic sciences, because it is capable of identifying an individual to a level of statistics that will allow a jury to feel very sure, yes, the fingerprint, yes, the DNA of that man was on the bottle and the bottle was in the room and that's where the murder happened. Therefore, we are sure. Expert evidence is clearly something that all criminal lawyers have to know how to deal with extremely well. I remember being part of a bar council team that presented a demo about how to cross-examine experts. And generally for us, the experts won't necessarily always be DNA. They could be gun residue, blood splatter, fingerprints, footprints. But at the moment, the passion is DNA. So my preparation has included reading 2 or 3 up-to-date articles about DNA from the forensic science point of view. And what better way to prepare my cross-examination by reminding myself of how do they approach it? What precisely do they do? And what are the meanings of all these technical words that they use? Because I have found in my reading, and I have so much time to read about it, so I've read it from the American point of view, the Canadian and the British. I've read 2 of the leading articles about it. And my passion has led me to consider that part of my preparation is going to have to be, well, your statistics have come below 1 in a million. And our criminal audience who are listening will know that that's the level at which an expert shouldn't go below for meaningful statistics analysis of it's more likely to be your client because it's 1 in a million chance that it can't be anybody else. So the statistics provided in my present case are below that figure. So I'm already beginning to think about the sorts of things that I am likely to want to ask. And it's preparation for cases. It does help if you're passionate about a point in a case at that time, because you are genuinely interested. You genuinely fight and want to find the points. And that's what it's all about when you defend.
Yes. Interesting. I wonder if that's one of the things you love about the bar, the opportunity, certainly for me, to become almost expertise in different areas, secondary to being experts, not just in advocacy, but in the law and in preparation. Is that one of the attractions for you?
I think it absolutely is. And, you need to still get passionate about things, however long you've been at the bar. I'm 1981 called and I got silk in 1999 and became a part-time judge in the same year, 1999. I was astonished that I got appointed on both, but I have to confess, the truth is, I didn't know that I thought I might not get either. So I thought, well, looking at these forms, the content does overlap. So look, Anesta, if you're going to have to spend 2 to 3 days filling out one form, just do both and hope and pray that you will get one. And that's why I did apply for both. I am still, even now, I walk out and I often have to remind myself, well, you are a QC, so you better do a little bit more work on this. It's wonderful to have been appointed and to get the accolade. It's still pretty amazing for me and wonderful.
Absolutely. Now, I ask everybody this question, and so I'm going to ask you. I am a black woman. I'm specialize in crime, and I'm passionate about diversity in our profession and increasing it. And I just wonder what you think about diversity, whether it be in terms of race, gender, and social mobility. And I wonder, what can each of us do in the legal profession to improve it, do you think?
I think it has improved substantially, but there is still more room to go. We need some more Afro-Caribbean judges in the High Court. I'm content to sit as a recorder for as long as they will have me, but I absolutely am still too passionate about being an advocate to want to sit full time. What I adore is the balance I have of sitting part-time and still being able to be an advocate and being able to train lawyers here in the UK and internationally. Taking that time out when you sit as a High Court judge is not always possible, but I like the mix of what I do. I think what we can do individually is giving support to ethnic minorities when you are asked to do it. I know that I often get very busy and I can't always do that. But my main pro bono work, which I consistently do and have made a plan to do, is to train lawyers. And that
Yes.
includes quite a lot of more ethnic minorities than I saw when I joined the bar. And internationally, there are huge numbers of black lawyers struggling in other Commonwealth countries that really appreciate that you've given up your time voluntarily and we don't get paid to do this. And South Africa, for example, is one of the countries I go to quite frequently. And we have now increased the number of black lawyers who are being trained in South Africa, where I am thankfully fairly frequently invited. We are now promoting some of those lawyers to become trainers themselves. So we've turned the corner with South Africa, and we all know of the plight of black people there. So
Yes.
it's a struggle for black people in South Africa to become QCs. So I make it my business to ensure that my pro bono work on training lawyers continues, because I think it's good to do a little bit for no money. It's much more difficult now with the reduction in legal aid. We all have to live, whether we have families or not. And those of us who can set aside the time and the money to do pro bono work should do it, and I can.
Yes. Fantastic. Now, I want to ask you about what you do for well-being. You do a lot. You're not only practicing in silk as a QC with your complex work, but it's an international practice. You're teaching advocacy. You're one of the Inns of Court advocacy trainers. You've probably been doing it for all my time at the bar. You're a bencher at Gray's Inn.
Yes.
What do you do to try and relax for well-being? You mentioned music and the art. I know you're very keen on the arts and galleries as well, but what
Yes.
do you do to try and just have headspace and mindfulness? Because well-being is important, but burnout is high at the bar. Let's be honest about it.
It
What do you
is.
do?
Well, I'm delighted that the bar has recognised it and certainly are along with others, we're at the forefront of lectures being given and inviting speakers in to deal with it. I'm quite lucky in that I've always tried to do something which is a little different. Where I live, I'm a member of my local choir. I fortunately don't always get to go to the rehearsals because of my work and because I'm out of the country. And I think they think that she's very odd, you know. She does turn up, and when she sings, it's pretty good, but she's never here. And now, of course, that we're not allowed to gather, that's difficult.
Yeah.
And I used to regularly sing in my choir in school and in a chamber choir at my university. I took my mother. My mother is 93 this year, and 2 years ago, on her 90th, I said to my mother, "Would you like to go to the Royal Festival Hall?" So she said yes. Anyway, I took her to this classical concert. I never understood that my mother liked classical music. She absolutely adored it. And I came home and she had rung several members of the family, and one or two of them rang up and said, "Oh, your mother keeps talking about how extraordinary this man, the conductor, waved his hand and the orchestra just magically did exactly as they were meant to." This is her description of what we saw. And I was so touched. And I think it's just a great opportunity because at Christmas I stay with my mother. She lives in Sheltered Housing, not very far from a North London suburb where we all live, in a North London suburb. And the drawback is that it's very hot in my mother's flat, too hot for me. And at night, she has an alarm clock, a wall clock that goes ding dong on the hour. So I think, no, Anesta, those two things are not good reasons not to stay for 3 days with your mother, Christmas Eve, Christmas Day, Boxing Day, because then I've got access to the rest of the family in the north. So I've had a chance to forget about law, talk to my mother, who's losing her memory now, and who I realise really likes music.
Yeah.
Relatively, I've understood it when she was in her 90s.
That's so great. Now, I want to ask you about advice or tips or guidance for people entering the law, and perhaps for those who are in the law to remain in the law.
I think that there's so much now on the web, much more than there was when I started, for people to look carefully at the detail of the sorts of things that each particular chambers will provide, the different areas of law, and the ability just to sit in the back of a courtroom, whether it be an employment tribunal or a tax tribunal, sit and watch. Ask judges whether you can sit with them. I certainly, whenever I am asked, especially for women who are still underrepresented in the judiciary, are very keen to encourage women to sit with other women,
Yes.
observe a case. So I do that quite regularly. And all the Crown Courts, once you give them notice that you're having somebody to sit with you, there is no difficulty with that at all. All the senior judges of each centre accommodate that. The second thing I would say to someone, and I discussed this with a young black woman from the Bahamas who works here in London, and she's looking to get a pupillage. She was preparing for an interview, so I said, "Would you like me to talk you through it?" And one of the things I said to her was to choose an interesting point of law that you have come across during your work. Tell them what it is, describe why you were quite excited about it, and describe what you found difficult about it and what you overcame in that difficulty, because that demonstrates not only that she understood the point, but also that she was able to talk about it and potentially apply it to something else. Another alternative is for an interview is think of something within the public domain that is connected to law that really drives you mad. A change in law that you disagree with, but you need to explain why. So choose something or go on to a webpage for your area of law and find an interesting case, because everything is online, and say why you find this particular case really interesting. And if you could apply it to another set of circumstances that you've come across, then do so. You don't have to choose law in London. go on a webpage internationally, a country that you may have been to. What's wrong with their law? What do you think might be improved if you had an opportunity to go to that country to improve it? What people look for when they interview is that you talk like a prospective, exciting lawyer, that you demonstrate that you have understood an area of law, that you speak about it concisely, succinctly, and clearly, and that there is an edge and passion to what you say. And it means that you're able to sell yourself without being pedestrian about it. Because at an interview, when you're asked, well, why did you want to do law? People roll things out which are fairly pedestrian. But if you
Yes.
suddenly say, well, I went on holiday to this particular country and I came back and I thought I might just Google what their law was on X. And I was astonished that it was this, that, and the other. And I read a case on it and I thought, well, we're pretty good in London. And maybe what could happen in that country, there you go. You've already got 10 minutes or so to talk about your own personal choice of a particular legal point.
Now, my next question is about fiction. One, whether you've got a favorite fictional lawyer and why. And two, do you have a favorite book or books which have really had an impact on you, your life or career? I don't mean legal books, but that you could share with us.
I'm afraid I really loved Rumpel of the Bailey. I thought he was brilliant. I really, really enjoyed it. And he was excellent. He suited the role so brilliantly well. I really enjoyed that. Your second question, a really interesting one, a book that inspired me. Yes, in South Africa, one of the trainers from South Africa, we were talking about books, and he said, have you read The Ghost of King Leopold? King Leopold's Ghost is the actual title. And I said, no. He said, you must read it. So I didn't say anything else. He said, I'm going to talk about it, just read it. I came back and I bought the book. It was astonishing that I had not known of its existence. So I only read this book about 2-3 years ago. Adam Hochschild is the writer of the book, and by the name, he's not a black person. And he wrote about a person, Edmund Morel, who himself was not a black person. And Edmund Morel was an employee of a shipping company, and they had the exclusive rights to carry in and out of the then Congo Free State, as it was called. We are talking about the 1890s, 1910.
Yes.
Edmund Morel discovered that whenever they would take things from the Congo, there was nothing exchanged. That's how things used to be done in those days. And he said, this is all very odd. I might want to have a little bit of a look at it. He did, and discovered that millions of people were being killed, maimed, and just treated extraordinarily badly. Hands cut off, things like that. And the total count was something like 10 million people in the Congo were just slaughtered. Now, everybody knows, of course, that Leopold is from that very famous place in Europe where they make chocolate, Belgium. But the long and the short of this story is Edmund Morel was the instigator of the very first ever and the biggest at the time human rights campaign internationally around the world, starting in the States, to stop the killing of people in the Congo. And if you look at the time of 1890, 1910, it's an extraordinary thing for a white person to stand up and be counted in the protection of individuals whom, in those days, they didn't need to do that. And it's just nice to have a book where somebody had a heart and he didn't need to do it, but he did. And it is beautifully written by Adam Hochschild.
Yes.
One gravitates towards books about Black people. The topic was about Black people, of course, so that was interesting. But the person who instigated it was not Black, but he had the heart and the knowledge and understanding, this is not right. So that's a book that really inspired me. I like books. about history. So Amanda Foreman, who's very well known, who wrote Georgiana, Duchess of Devonshire, is
Yes.
a brilliant book about how a woman became a fashion icon, that she gambled at a time where gambling was considered to be immoral and that gambling debts could not be enforced. I was interested in the detail of that because I was privileged to be appointed onto the government's first gambling review committee all the years ago before the law changed, before you can now sue. And I had a civil servant ring up from the Home Office to say, we wondered whether you might be interested in sitting on a gambling review. I said, oh, I'm so sorry. You must have the wrong person because I don't gamble. So this rather bright civil servant said, oh, no, we know you don't gamble, but we don't think it's relevant whether you gambled, and we think it's probably better that you don't. I said, oh, but I don't know anything about the law of gambling. That's why we're asking you. So I got to sit on this committee. And the most exciting thing, well, it was all very exciting. It was fantastic the way we had these debates about there should be no morality about gambling because we don't have morals, do we, about people who drink and people who take drugs. So this
Yeah.
committee had the most wonderful, interesting things about it. I then said at one of the meetings, oh, I think we really ought to look at the international aspect of gambling. We really wouldn't want to produce this recommendation unless we know what's going on elsewhere. Well, what did you have in mind, said this rather nervous civil servant who has a very small budget, and we were not being paid. We were given an honorarium. So I said, well, if it's at all possible, I think places like Europe who have bigger gambling issues, and of course Las Vegas.
Yeah.
Well, there was ums and ahs about that, but the story ends well. I went to Las Vegas.
Wow.
And that was the very first time I went to Las Vegas. But it was a working trip. You got your Fitboard, you went around and you noticed how the right arm of somebody was much fatter than the left arm because that was the arm that run the machine for maybe 10 hours. And there was no clock anywhere because one must not worry about the time when you're gambling. So there was another fantastically interesting thing I was asked to do because I'm a lawyer and because I'm a silk. Just a great, great thing to happen to me.
And is it important, therefore, in one's career to, when these opportunities arise, to say yes? Because quite often, we're all busy, families, practice, so on and so forth. It's easy for one to say, no, actually, I don't have the time.
There are two aspects to saying yes. You are right. If you are a male or female with child duties and that will interrupt it significantly to the detriment of the children, you might not be able to say yes to that.
Yes.
The second thing to think about is, do I think I'm the right person to carry out that particular task? Some of what we do might have political aspects to it or aspects to it that may make you feel uncomfortable. Oh, the government gambling view certainly didn't. And I'm hard pushed to find things that you might be asked to do which you wouldn't want to do. But there might be, and you might want to think carefully, well, thank you for asking, but I think there might be a political agenda here which doesn't make me feel comfortable, so I don't want to do it. I don't, for example, think when I was asked, well, would you like to sit as a part-time judge? And I said, I'd like to, but I don't know anything about settling an indictment. And in those days, I was in a set where we didn't prosecute because that was what happened at Cloisters. So I thought long and hard about this, and I thought, it might upset a few people within the chambers if I'm suddenly being seen as a black woman to prosecute. I'm afraid. I thought long and hard about it, and the decision was no. I think black people should be seen to be judges, and they should prosecute because there are black victims, there are white victims, there are just victims, whatever their colour is. So I did put a few noses out of joint, and the silk, now deceased Michael Hill QC, Jewish, bit of a Rockweiler advocate, led me 3 times, just a brilliant man, said, I think you should do it. And I can certainly introduce you to somebody who you might want to talk to about it. And that was the beginnings of my sit-in, at the invitation of somebody who said, I think you should do it. So there's a really good example, I think, of where you should think perhaps even of a broader picture about why it's in the interest of the bar that there is a balance of individuals that prosecute, that sit as judges.
Fantastic. Now, I noticed with many of kind of the role models or those along the way, Michael Mansfield, you've named, and others, they've been largely men. So I wonder, were there any women senior to you or even as contemporaries? Because particularly at the criminal bar, not many women, and certainly not many black women. Were there any role models or any that you can talk of?
You look up to the women that are in your circle. So that's
Yes,
within Gray's Inn, within my
yes,
chambers, in chambers, somebody like Laura Cox. She led me, if not once, possibly twice, on an employment law case. You
yes,
learn,
fantastic.
absolutely, you learn from them. One of my referees for Silk was the great and late Anne Kerno QC. She was, I think, a role model. She, I think, undoubtedly gave me a decent reference because I got Silk the first time for asking, and slightly early in those days.
Fantastic.
I looked up to her. She was very well prepared, a brilliant advocate. I remember going to the Bailey, and there was another Silk there whose name misses me at the moment, but it will come back to me. But when I describe her, everybody listening will know who she was. I wore a striped shirt. It's predominantly white, but it was striped. And she said, "You're not going into court with that shirt on, are you?" I said, "Well, unfortunately, yes, because I don't have one to change into." "Well, tomorrow, wear a proper one, which is white." I did wear a white shirt
Ah,
the next day. This is a long time ago. And, she was the backbone for the bar, the right thing to do. And I think I wanted to do well, and I certainly didn't want to put out my nose out of joint by wearing the wrong sort of clothing. We're much more relaxed about all of that now. So
yeah,
role models there were no black Silks at the time. We soon had a few coming through in the 80s, as you know.
yeah,
But it took a while. And it was sometimes a little bit lonely. Sometimes you felt maybe too much in the limelight, but you just get used to it. It's a job, and you concentrate on the client and the work and just decide that's the environment in which I find myself, and I will do the best I can. I was hugely encouraged by the majority were white people because they were the people who were at the bar, who were in Silk,
yes,
who were High Court judges. I
yes,
appeared in front of High Court judges who then were able to talk about your performance. So whilst people say, there may be racism within the bar, I can only tell you from my own experience, I was encouraged by predominantly senior white Silks and judges. And I'm grateful for that and remain immensely grateful. So now I encourage others,
yes.
be they white and black.
Before we move on, I wanted to ask you about a modern day role model. Do you have a modern day role model?
Yes, I do. About 2 years ago, Ursula Burns was invited to London to speak to an organisation, and I happened to be a guest of someone who attended. I was supremely impressed. Ursula Burns, is the first black CEO of Xerox, which everybody's familiar with. 2009 was when she was the first black CEO. And we know that that's a Fortune 500 company. She's the first, and I think the only. But when she spoke, she's incredibly professional, effortlessly professional. She had confidence, and she has a wonderful awareness of who she is in the environment in which she worked and where she came from. And she talked about her background, she talked about her father, she talked about, should I really cut my hair? And it was a big afro in those days. And she slipped something in, which was about hair. But I was just so blown away with her. She had obviously, against all the odds, got to the top, but everybody voted for her. There were no dissenters. And there she was, a black woman surrounded by white men. So you think about my travel through the bar, hers was actually, in many ways, much more difficult because it's about my individual performance. But she was the
Yes.
CEO of a company that was listed, and anything could have gone wrong. So I was really blown away with her. And I've remembered her ever since, and of course, Googled her and read lots more about her. So I remember her very well. That's my modern day hero.
Your modern day, I love that. I mean, how important is it for people to have role models and modern day heroes? I'm not talking about sponsors, do they keep you going? Sometimes, there's late nights when you think, oh, why should I bother? Should everyone have one?
Absolutely. You need to read widely. Google and the web is brilliant. It has its downsides, but in terms of accessing people, and as long as you read the right news and not the fake news, you can find out about people. But heroes come in all sorts of sizes. Everybody talks about Muhammad Ali. For me, as a child, when I grew up in Finsbury Park, which was then not very popular because lots of immigrants would live in one room. You have a paraffin heater to heat it. That's where my mum, my sister, me, and my father, and my sister, who was born disabled and died very early, would live, and my brother.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
So it wasn't glamorous, but that's when you come as an immigrant here and you are born into a working class family. In Finsbury Park, where I grew up, the very first black man I ever saw on television, and I thought he was stunningly good looking, and I was between 5 and 8, maybe 10. But the thing that absolutely amazed me, he talked non-stop. He was witty, he was amazing, but he would really talk. And I thought, how the hell did he get away with saying, I am so pretty, I am the greatest? How the hell does he get away with saying that? Somebody's going to knock him out. Somebody's going to shoot him dead. They never did. That's what heroes are for. I was superbly impressed by his bravery, and that lived with me when I came to choose the bar. And what do barristers do? They get up and they say things. They just are brave. They say it. But this man was the best advocate I ever saw when I was 5 and 10. So that's where the advocacy thing happens in your head. You look back and you think, well, when you get up and you talk and you do speeches, who was the first person that you ever saw do a speech which you were blown away with? He was handsome, he was tall, he was strong, and he would rhyme. He would say things that rhymed. I watched his fight, The Rumble in the Jungle. Ali, Ali, Bumbaye, Bumbaye. You never forget things like that. So he, male I know, was a role model.
Absolutely. Well, might I just ask you this? I'm a great believer in you can't be what you don't see for various reasons. But is there an argument that actually some of the arguments about certainly race and gender, or sexuality for that matter, shouldn't be coming from those with those characteristics, but rather they should be coming from the majority? Our male colleagues who realize, crikey, we don't want our daughters having to do umpteen hours just to get ahead, or whatever. Or, our white colleagues, as you've described, who I've interviewed frequently on here, who just say, well, discrimination is just wrong. And so are biases and unconscious biases. Is there an argument that actually the allies we need don't need to look like us or be us?
I'm absolutely agreeing with you about that. No question about it. Your supporters can come from anywhere. For example, because I know that we both do work, you do, and I do talks wherever I'm asked for the Association of Women Barristers.
Yes.
There does come a time, this is my personal thought, that we need to communicate more with men about what is it that they do that we say is discriminatory about our sex. The workplace environment, if it's about men, I understand the need for the women groups and black groups, but there comes a time where you may periodically want to invite the very people that you think are not quite getting it right. Let them hear constructively your concerns. Because if they know
Yes.
about it and they can see that you're allowed to let them into your meeting, there's nothing secretive about the fact that you might be discriminated against because you are black. But if you want them to stop, they need to know about it. So exclusive meetings that always leave out your apparent perpetrators of the harm, you may want to just invite them a lot more, because you only need 2 or 3 men who are now on board and convinced, and those 3 will tell another 3, then you have 6 converted.
Here, here. Well, that's why we have men join our association, and they're very good. That's a wonderful. I'm coming towards the end of my many questions. I could keep going for hours on end. It's so wonderful to have you here, as a role model for me and many others out there, of whatever characteristic. But I wonder what's next. You are a highly intelligent QC practitioner of many years. As a bencher, you sit as a recorder. And I just wonder what's next for you. And, might you be persuaded to take the next step? That there are always vacancies in the Supreme Court.
Well, I've given that a lot of thought, and I did have specific encouragement to sit full time some time ago.
Yes.
But as I said earlier, I'm keen to keep the balance, and I just love advocacy. And for as long as I can still perform extremely well, not just well, but extremely well, and as long as I'm given work, then I think that's what I want to do. But it is important that we have more black women who are prepared to sit. That is actually quite important. Now with the lockdown, it does give you an opportunity to think carefully about where do you want to go next? Because at my level of seniority, I can, of course, continue. And it won't be for a huge number of years, but there's a few left that I'd like to continue. I think it's about whatever topic I think I might want to get involved in. It may not necessarily be about a court process, but it may be a court process. I have a real yearning for an improvement in international law, which appears to be non-existent for people trafficking, the abuse of women through people trafficking, the abuse of children, the abuse of refugees who leave a burnt-out village, where they get stuck in a boat and they die in that boat because the person who takes them across has decided, well, I'm going to keep all the women and then they'll be my sex slaves when they come to the other country. Or the boat capsizes, or they are transferred into a lorry and the refrigerator doesn't work and they die. Now, if you just put together that terrible lack of international law to help any of those victims, it's a huge task, and I'm not suggesting for one moment that I'm going to write a book about it, but we might want to, as lawyers, when we do have our free time, and if there comes a time in the next 5 to 10 years that I do less work, I'd like to begin to think about that. How do we get money out of bank accounts which have been sifted away by dishonest leaders who, with just one bank account, can remove the need for women to ever get their girls to carry water for miles away from a village? They can wipe out the need to travel for water by running pipes. If you just get one bank account and get the money out of it, well, where's the law to do that? It does exist, but apparently nobody does it. And we might want to just review why these extraordinary atrocities occur when people are fleeing to come for help, but they actually sometimes don't get to us. And when they do, we don't open our arms. So that's the next thing that's on my mind.
Fantastic.
I won't be able to solve that on my own, but I might want to start, talking to significant people about whether internationally groups of lawyers can get together to rethink small bits of that mess I just very quickly summarized to see what could be done. But you do have to kick back, sit back, and think about it. and put the law in front of you, find out where the gaps are, to think about it. We don't do enough of, are we creating new law? Are we suggesting new law? We had this new law to deal with coronavirus.
Yes.
And that was an emergency because people were dying. But there are other emergencies, which I've just described. And we don't look again for what can we bring about as an emergency law. So those were my thoughts have gone occasionally when I've been rather too bored in my house and I've already done my walk and I've done my shopping and there's not much else to do.
Well, just before we finish then, we mentioned
Yes.
coronavirus. I said I would come back to it when I started this interview. And it's really this. We are in the lockdown. How do you think, well, two things. How do you think that the COVID-19 will affect our working practices at the bar and the criminal bar? And two, what do you think about this whole notion of trial by digital means, everybody, jury zooming in or whatever?
I think everyone, whether they be lawyers or non-lawyers, have come to the conclusion that we can do so much more online. That's taken as read. I think that we have to carefully rethink, and I know lots of judges are already carefully rethinking how we might think about jury trials when COVID is over. We will go back to the norm, I think, but the advantage that we will have is that practice directions, I think, should always be online, because asking junior members of the bar to go miles out of London to cover a practice direction where the amount they receive is not even half of their travel can be avoided. So that's a real plus for me going ahead. I don't think that we can change the setup for a jury trial. A judge who sits needs to keep an eye on the jury. He needs to keep an eye on the dock. He needs to be in the courtroom at a reasonable distance. It is brilliant for family lawyers, I think. I think more can be done in that respect. So going forward, I think it gives us time to rethink. Is it possible to have a fundamental change of how we do jury trials? I think it's difficult. I think you need to be in the courtroom. Family
Yes.
law, that may make a difference. Some of employment law, possibly. If you don't have too many witnesses, you can do that on a link. I certainly have always used Zoom for my international work, so I was very familiar with that. Not having to travel miles to the Caribbean for a Court of Appeal hearing lasting 2 hours was excellent, because it means that the government who pays me to prosecute, and it comes out of public funds, doesn't have to pay the airfare of some £2,500. It's never business class for me, I'm afraid. It's always cattle class, as they call it, but it is publicly funded work.
Yes.
So I think moving forward, we've all learnt and we've all had time, I think, to think through what we do and what we don't want to do for the future.
Fantastic. Anesta Weekes, you've been a wonderful guest on here and escaped all my questions, so to speak. I mean by that, you answered them beautifully. Thank you so much for coming on Talking Law podcast. You're a role model to many, visibly everywhere, and I'm delighted you've given up your time to be interviewed here on this podcast. Thank you so much.
I've enjoyed it very much, and I'm really grateful to be up there with all the other important people that you've had on your podcast. Thank you very much, Sally.
A huge thank you to the very inspiring Anesta Weekes QC for talking law with me today. Thank you again for listening to Talking Law with me, Sally Penni. You can find me on Twitter @SallyPenni1. Please do leave us a review. We'd love to get your feedback. Don't forget to visit us at womeninthelawuk.com for all the latest news about our organisation. Thank you again for listening. Talking Law was produced by Sam Walker and is a What Goes On media production.